Australia's most decorated soldier disgraced. Ben Robert Smith lost more than just the defamation case he brought against 3 newspapers. A civil court judge also found the former soldier committed war crimes in Afghanistan. What now for the former serviceman, and will there be justice for the victims? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. He attempted to clear his name, but instead left his reputation in tatters. The judgment in the landmark defamation case found that ex-soldier Ben Robert Smith was complicit in the murder of 4 Afghan civilians and that he lied and threatened witnesses to cover up his misconduct. The papers that published the story say the truth has finally won. Here's a look now at how it played out.
To say on behalf of all Australians, how proud we are of you, how much you mean to us.
That was Corporal Ben Robert Smith, receiving Australia's highest military honour for single-handedly defeating 2 Taliban machine gun positions during the Afghan war. The Victoria Cross made him the country's most decorated soldier and a national hero.
I'm here representing everyone else back home, the whole ADF, and more importantly my team who were with me on the day.
But in 2018, cracks started to appear in that fame. 3 Australian journalists published a series of articles about his alleged misconduct during service. They accused Robert Smith of killing unarmed prisoners and civilians in Afghanistan. He denied the claims and sued the newspapers for defamation. Last week, the judge reached a verdict, finding the stories published about him were substantially true.
Today is a day of justice. It's a day of justice for those brave men of the SAS who stood up and told the truth about who Ben Robert Smith is. A war criminal, a bully and a liar. Today is a day of some small justice for the Afghan victims of Ben Robert Smith.
One of those victims was Ali Jan. He was a villager from Darwan. The judgment revealed that in 2012, Robert Smith kicked the handcuffed man in the chest off a high cliff. Ali Jan survived the fall, but was seriously injured. Robert Smith then ordered a soldier to shoot him dead.
There were 2 soldiers who dragged Ali Jan by his arms, while his hands were handcuffed behind him to the cornfield where many shots were fired. His face was covered with the dust blown by the helicopters taking off when the soldiers left.
The case revealed other shocking incidences too. During a mission called Whiskey 108 in 2009, 2 unarmed men walked out of a secret tunnel in a bombed Taliban compound and surrendered. Robert Smith ordered the execution of one. Then he machine-gunned the other, who had a prosthetic leg, in the back. Another soldier kept the man's leg as a souvenir, and it was used as a beer-drinking vessel by the troops. Afghans are angry about the findings. They want justice for all the crimes committed against their people.
He should be executed in the same place where he martyred innocent Afghan civilians. Foreigners who have committed such a crime in different parts of the country have to be tried. All such cases should be well investigated by the international community, if they really claim they uphold justice.
There are calls to strip Robert Smith's military honours and remove his uniform, medals and portraits from the war memorial. But others maintain he's innocent until proven guilty in a criminal court, and his lawyers can still appeal the defamation verdict. 3 years after the Brereton report exposed the war crimes committed in Afghanistan, only 1 soldier has been criminally charged. Robert Smith's case may be the turning point for Australia, an opportunity to ensure accountability for abusers, and it could also set an example for other Western countries like the UK and the US, urging them to face up to the darker sides of their wars in Afghanistan and beyond.
Well, joining me now to discuss these alleged war crimes in Afghanistan and what should happen to Ben Robert Smith are from Washington, Omar Samad. He is the former Afghan ambassador to France and to Canada. From Sydney, we have David Oldfield. He's a retired member of Parliament and a political commentator. And from Canberra, Peter Stanley is a military historian and a professor at the University of New South Wales. Thanks all so much for joining us. David, I'll start with you and ask what you make of this judgment. Would you consider Ben Roberts-Smith a war criminal at this point, and would you want to see the process against him taken further?
Well, look, the important thing to understand here is this is a civil case. Now, one might argue that Ben Roberts-Smith was somewhat foolish to have taken these people for defamation or attempted to have himself found as having been defamed. But no, he's not guilty of anything at this point. He will need to be subjected to a criminal case for there to be actual guilt ascertained. At this point in time, he's merely a man who has, in his case, unfortunately lost a whole series of defamation actions and spent a lot of money to, well, have his reputation, at least in a public sense, tarnished dreadfully.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember, you had said that he is still actually an enormously courageous soldier, and that also there is never a war without war crimes. So do you feel maybe a sense of sympathy for him?
I don't have any sympathy for people who are murderers. It's not been established in any criminal sense or beyond doubt in a criminal court that he is a murderer. That's not been established. Should that be established, then I won't have a great deal of sympathy for him, except in the sense of understanding that men such as Ben Roberts-Smith are sent into these situations. And yes, I repeat, absolutely, there are no wars without there being war criminals. There are always crimes in wars. That doesn't mean, of course, that these things are in any way excusable, not one iota. But there must be some responsibility also shared by the people who sent him, by the people who commanded him. Bear in mind that Ben Roberts-Smith never attained a rank beyond corporal. So there are many people above him in a command structure. And of course, there's the question over whether he should have been there in the first place. I mean, I would argue Australia should never have been engaged in Afghanistan, but that, of course, perhaps is a broader debate.
Definitely. A topic for an entire program in itself. But then let me ask Peter, I mean, does the chain of command here really go up to the top? Should there be more responsibility for what happened on the field in Afghanistan on behalf of Australian soldiers than just Ben Roberts-Smith at this point?
Yes, Ben Roberts-Smith pulled the trigger several times and killed several people. But as David says, he was sent into combat by a command structure and by governments. And there's a curious absence at the heart of this case where, as you say, there's a corporal on trial, and yet a command chain should have known, must have known something of what he was doing, because he went back to Afghanistan 6 times. And whether men should have been sent to Afghanistan repeatedly, I think plays a part in our judgment on this. I think we can understand the circumstances in which he committed those crimes, but I think we should be in no doubt that, as Justice Anthony Basanko found, he did kill people and cause people to be killed.
Do you think those medals he received should be taken away? Should he be removed from the war memorial?
There are 2 questions there. The first point is that if he is charged with murders, and if he's found guilty, the Victoria Cross will be taken from him, because the precedent is that if a recipient is guilty of a crime, then he loses the medal. But as David says, he hasn't yet been found guilty of that crime, but the judge found it beyond reasonable doubt that or it was probable that he did commit crimes. So no, he won't be deprived of them until and if he's found guilty of murders. The point about the War Memorial.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Viewers should understand what the Australian War Memorial is. It's Australia's national place of commemoration for those Australians who served and died in war, and people whose relics, as they call them, their portraits, his uniforms, and so on, are displayed, are regarded as being particularly important. Now, some people are called for his to be taken out. I say, if he is effaced from history, then we won't know his story, and his story is important. It's important to know, as your headline says, truth wins. The truth is that some Australians committed terrible crimes in war, And they're part of the story of Australia's wars. So I think his uniforms and portraits should stay on display, but it should be explained that he was a hero, he was extolled as a hero, and then he was disgraced because he was found that he had committed terrible crimes.
Okay. Let me turn to Omar at this point, because you can bring us the Afghan perspective. How are people feeling about this case on the ground in Afghanistan, and what do they want for the victims?
Well, thank you for asking. I think it's obvious that people in Afghanistan on the ground, from what I can gather from the news media, are not only following this story, and not just this story in Australia, but in many other countries where there are allegations and there are court trials going on, with a lot of interest, of course, because it touched them personally. It touched the country in a population that whose lives were affected for over 20 years by the presence of NATO and foreign forces in Afghanistan under the guise of fighting terrorism, which they did at some level, and then it turned into something different. But that's a different story. I think that people want justice. I think Afghans are looking, whether it's from their own leaders, people who were in charge in Afghanistan and today are in charge in Afghanistan. They want them to be responsible for their actions, and they want justice for anything that has happened in the past. This is the country with 43 years of conflict behind them. And in the case of the Australians or others who have been involved for the past 20 years, obviously we now know that unfortunately there are some serious allegations of war crimes that are being investigated. And so for Afghans, due process is the most important issue.
Okay, Omar, but justice in what form? Do they just want to see, soldiers charged with these crimes convicted and feel justified in that the crimes were recognized? Or are they looking for some kind of either monetary compensation or any kind of compensation for that matter?
I don't think compensation is the first thing on an Afghan mind at this point. When you've lost your loved ones for no reason, or in these cases, not in combat, let's say, and civilians have been targeted on purpose, knowingly, then obviously just the fact that this is coming out is very important. The fact that there is a process, there is freedom of expression, there are investigations, the fact that they are talking to witnesses inside Afghanistan as well, and that all of this is being brought to light is very important. And then, of course, it's a question of how the judicial system works. And then at the end, obviously, there has to be some outcome, whether there's punishment, whether there's compensation, whether there is an acknowledgement that there are lessons to be learned from all of this. So I think Afghans are looking at all of it, but compensation is not the first thing on their mind.
Understood. David, I'll come back to you. I mean, should there be then some responsibility taken among the higher ranks of the Australian military within the Australian government for having sent these troops into Afghanistan? Is it as much their responsibility, as you alluded to, as it is for the soldiers that actually took the actions?
Look, certainly someone has to connect the dots as to who is going to be directly responsible apart from Ben Roberts-Smith. As Peter Stanley pointed out, Ben Roberts-Smith pulled the trigger, but he wasn't responsible for being in Afghanistan in the first place. And as has been pointed out also, he was there 6 times. So you really need to pin down who else in a matter of authority, who else actually had some understanding these things were taking place. It seems hard to believe that it was all just sort of a secret up until a couple of journalists decided to start talking about it or making an investigation just a few years ago. These events are said to have happened 10 and 11 and 12 years ago. So has there been a cover-up till now? Certainly you would have to expect that there is much more. There are many more people than just Ben Roberts-Smith who needs to be brought to account. Could I just say something, however, about the stripping of his medals? I do not under any circumstances believe that no matter what happens, even if he was ultimately convicted of having murdered civilians, as is alleged, even if that was ultimately to take place, he should still retain his Victoria Cross and his Medal for Gallantry. Now, I put that to you because these medals are not the subject of the actions of which there are allegations of wrongdoing, of war crimes. The medals are not in contention with regards to what is being alleged. He was awarded these medals for conspicuous gallantry. He wasn't awarded these medals for being a good bloke or a humanitarian or, some pillar of decency. You cannot escape the fact that at various points, he was an enormously heroic soldier who was awarded appropriately. You can't then suddenly turn around and say, oh, but hang on, you're a bad man and you're evil, so we're going to take away the awards that we've given you. The awards do not connect to the actions. He didn't murder anybody in any of the actions for which he was given these awards.
Peter, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I can understand why David feels that. There has been no connection established between the action for which Ben Roberts-Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross and the actions which he was found to have killed people. But the fact is that under the Royal Warrant for the Victoria Cross, and I understand the same provisions apply to the Victoria Cross for Australia, the precedent is, and it's happened 8 times, that if you're a Victoria Cross winner and you commit a crime, then you are stripped of your VC. And it doesn't have to be a very serious crime. Of the 8 cases of men being deprived of their medals, one of those men stole a cow, and yet he was deprived of his VC. So multiple murders, I think, qualifies to deprive a man of a VC, regardless of his bravery.
Fair enough. Peter, let me mention this.
But if I understand, it's been a very, very long time since anyone was deprived. And I'm sure you're aware that it was George V who said that even someone who is convicted of murder and hanged should not have their VC removed from. So there is quite a lot of support for not stripping medals from a person based on what they have done after the fact.
Let's continue to talk more about the wider implications of this, if we can. Peter, I'll come back to you quickly, because this whole thing could make one question, because this man was so respected and admired in Australia, if there can really be war heroes. It is war. War is about killing people that one side calls the enemy. Is it fair to expect that this can always be done somehow in this purely honest way?
That's a very good question, and it's a question that Australians ought to be asking themselves. I think the point is that wars are nasty, messy, horrible businesses, but especially now, rules apply to the conduct of war. And the Australian forces in Afghanistan had rules of engagement, and the Australian Army has standards which it expects its men and women to observe. And Ben Roberts-Smith contravened those standards. We have to remind ourselves that there were thousands of Australians who served in Afghanistan, and hundreds of members of the Special Air Service Regiment. Only a handful of them, perhaps 20 of them, committed crimes of this magnitude. So the fact is that war can be, the conduct of soldiers in war can be governed, can be regulated, and we can expect a standard of conduct, which this man has absolutely contravened.
Okay. Omar, I'm going to come back to you and change tact here, because there's also another side to this case, and that is who won it. The journalists won it. The media won it. How does that make you feel as an Afghan to know that it's safe, in a sense, for journalists to be able to report fairly, even in difficult territory like Afghanistan, and be allowed to hold people to account so that the world understands what really is happening in a country like yours?
It's extremely important. And I think that I have been struggling as a diplomat, and prior to that, actually, as a person in the media world before 2001, to seek the truth, to be objective, and to make sure that we tell all sides and we allow all sides to tell their story rightly and honestly. So I think in the case of Afghanistan, it's very murky. First of all, it was a very long war. A lot of things have happened, good and bad. I don't want to just dwell on the negative. There were good things done. There were good intentions at the beginning. There were good intentions all along. But then, as I wrote in my tweet the other day, this war went astray, unfortunately, for a lot of different reasons. We can get into that. But I think that at this point, now that it's over for Afghans, hopefully we think that war is not going to revisit us after 4 decades, that there are a lot of lessons to learn for everyone. Those who intervene militarily, those who defend, those who are called and labeled good or bad terrorist, insurgent, counterinsurgent, freedom fighter, whatever label we give to people, we need to look at it in the context of reality on the ground. So one person's hero, one person's decorated war hero is another person's killer and criminal. And that applies to all sides, to the Afghan side as well. There are those who think they are heroes. So for journalism, I think it's a great experiment. It's a great, I think, case to look into, and I hope that it is a lesson for others in other countries. Those who espouse democracy and freedom of expression, they need to look into these cases because we do not want to keep on repeating the mistakes of the past.
David, quickly, you also alluded to this earlier on. I mean, if he hadn't pursued this defamation case, in which now so much has been revealed, would he be here today?
No, I don't believe he would be. I think from a public point of view, the wiser thing, and it's easy for me to say this after the fact, but if indeed he knew himself to be guilty, and I'm not saying he is, but if indeed he knew himself to be guilty of these things, it was absolute insanity to pursue defamation. He should have just said, that's their view, that's not what happened, I say no more. He basically should have just cut it off and stopped it and copped the bad press, and it would potentially be over by now. So I think it was, from a propaganda point of view, from a PR point of view, it was decidedly foolish to go after defamation if you have in the back of your mind that you may in fact have done exactly what is alleged. Well, look, we're yet to find that out in any possible criminal proceedings. Can I just say, for those of us who have not been in combat, and I don't mean this in any sense to stand up for Ben Roberts-Smith, but I can tell you, my uncle, great uncle and father were all combat veterans of World War II, and my brother of Vietnam. My great uncle died in World War II. My uncle went through the Middle East and in New Guinea.
It's psychologically
my father
very
was
trying.
shot down, captured by the Japanese.
Yeah.
We have, in many respects, fought in wars where one side had rules and the other side didn't. I wouldn't stand up for anybody committing war crimes, but these are the sorts of things that need to be discussed at length and at great breadth in a full criminal trial to get to the complete bottom of exactly what took place and why. And should someone be found guilty under those circumstances, then indeed they should be punished.
Okay, we're down to our last few minutes. Peter, I see you had a comment, but also please do, this is the most expensive defamation trial now in Australian history, and it is important to know who's actually going to have to pay for it. Will this actually fall on Ben Roberts-Smith?
No, because he's been backed by a billionaire. Ben Roberts-Smith has been supported by Kerry Stokes, one of the media billionaires in Australia, who's bankrolled his very expensive legal case. And so it'll probably, both sides' expenses will probably have to be picked up by Kerry Stokes. I think that's a really important point to make here, and that is that, in a sense, that while this has been a great victory for truthful, honest, open journalism, it's also relatively unnecessary because in the background to this, the Australian Army conducted a massive investigation into possible war crimes, and as identified through the investigation of General Paul Brereton, who in 2020 found 39 instances of crimes of similar magnitude. And it's likely that Ben Roberts-Smith would be on a list and would be investigated and possibly could be charged. So even if this case had never happened, it's quite possible that in several years' time, we would have the same outcome because the same fair legal processes would have been at work.
Quickly, Peter, as a war historian, have you ever seen a case like this?
This case is unprecedented, but there are, as David says, war crimes are committed in war, regardless of the legality of it, of the legal outcomes. And the closest parallel in Australian military history is in the Boer War, the South African War, when 2 Australians were executed, because that's how they treated murderers in those days, they were executed for having killed a dozen unarmed war civilians. So it's not the first time that Australians have faced legal consequences for killing unarmed civilians.
Okay. Peter, unfortunately, that's going to have to be the final word. Omar, I apologize for not being able to get back to you, but we are completely out of time. For this edition of The Newsmakers, I'd like to thank all 3 of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.